In wake of the disastrous Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviet Army carried out the next phase of their strategic battle plan by pushing far and wide, taking a large amount of territory back from the Germans. It looked like the Soviets would steamroller the German army, but for the Soviets there were a few problems. First, even with a carefully prepared and supplied fresh army, frontline battles took their toll on both the attackers and defenders. To get a deeper understanding of this, please watch my other video called Military Culminating Point, which goes into much greater detail about this subject. Even if the attacking army has weak enemy opposition, things can and will go wrong for them. Their fuel and ammo supplies run low. Some tanks break just from routine use. Men get tired of marching with little sleep after the initial adrenaline rush wears off. After the constant winter fighting, some Soviet divisions were down to 1,000 to 2,000 combat-capable men. After the German plans for the invasion of France, codenamed Fallgelb, or Case Yellow, fell into Allied hands in January 1940, Hitler cast about for another plan. He stated that the whole operation would have to be built on a new basis in order to secure secrecy and surprise. Erich von Manstein, the former Chief of Staff of German Army Group A, had been championing a new invasion concept for some months, in which the principal thrust would be on Belgium's northeastern frontier, and the German panzer divisions were to be concentrated further south. It was daring and somewhat risky, but it involved an attack with panzers through the heavily wooded Ardennes forest, something that the Allies would never expect. In fact, they discounted a tank attack from the area as even possible. The Germans adopted this plan, which worked so well that the Allies were unhinged and the fall of France was only a matter of time. This led to the Germans occupying Paris and the rest of northwestern France. With France secured and the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth still at bay, in 1941, Hitler looked to the east. Manstein later invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa and personally oversaw the conquest of the Crimea. Later, he attempted, against all odds, to rescue the 6th Army at Stalingrad, but he and his ersatz army weren't able to do so. By the time of the aforementioned Bewegungskrieg, Manstein had been promoted to Field Marshal, so that brings us up to date on Manstein. In Manstein's mind, there were two ways to look at warfare. The first he called the forehand, which was the traditional way of thinking. An army that wanted to attack gathered up its forces on the front line, and when the whistle blows, they charge out into the field. Artillery fires, planes swoop in, etc. Then there was a second way of looking at fighting a battle, called the backhand. This was quite the opposite of the forehand strategy. In this revolutionary way of warfare, the side using a backhand strategy would defend very little, but would concentrate forces in a few areas, separated by a large distance. The backhand general would try to discover the enemy's intentions and ultimate goals. If he could correctly guess the enemy's goal, say a certain city, then he could position his troops in the best way for later operations. After the attacking army wore itself out with marching, fighting, and was low on supplies and overextended, the backhand general would attempt to avoid enemy concentrations and attack behind the attacking army. Sun Tzu also mentioned it's best to attack where they least expect it and where they are weak. This had many benefits. First, attacking the enemy at weak points was easier and more prone to success than attacking their strong units. Second, it was disconcerting for the Soviet soldier in the front line to realize that he had just been cut off by the Germans, who were supposedly on the run and defeated. It tended to halt attacks, lowered morale, and was confusing, making them wonder where the actual front line was. Third, it cut the supply routes of the forehand army. Any army that goes too long without supplies will wither and perish. Fourth, there's a strong possibility that the suddenly surrounded army will be annihilated. Both sides knew this. This forced the forehand commander to choose between three bad options: keep pushing forward regardless, halt operations and defend, halt forward operations, reverse course and hope that you can break back into your lines. The forehand attacker's men are already tired, with low supplies, so every choice has a problem. Building upon the success of the encirclement of Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command expected a collapse of the German front line in southern Russia and ordered the two operations to begin within a few days of each other to exploit the weak German situation. The Soviet Southwest Front commenced Operation Gallop on January 29. The offensive was initially successful as the Soviets broke through the weak German lines. Operation Star began on February 1st with the goal of taking Kharkov. It also protected the right flank of the Southwest Front. When it became dangerously apparent that the Soviets could possibly cut off and trap the 1st and 4th Panzer Armies and Army Group Holit against the Sea of Azov, both Field Marshals von Kluge and von Manstein personally appealed to Hitler, who agreed to allow a withdrawal to a defensive position behind the river Mios. The Soviet offensives, initially successful, ultimately outran their supply lines. During a counteroffensive at Kharkov, the Germans were able to regain the momentum. On February 19, 1943, Manstein launched his Kharkov counterstrike, using the fresh SS Panzer Corps and 2 other panzer armies. In effect, the Germans were counterattacking with 160,000 men against 210,000 Soviet soldiers. However, the Germans had a 7-to-1 advantage in armor at the point of attack, along with a massive amount of air support. Months later, when the German High Command was planning its summer offensive, Hitler finally made the decision to attack first at the Battle of Kursk, also known as Operation Citadel. Hitler chose the forehand option, but of course he didn't call it that. Surprisingly, the Stavka chose the backhand strategy. There could be many reasons why the Soviets, who were strong and getting stronger every day, chose this. But it may be due to intelligence information that the Germans were going to attack first, and they had an idea of where the German avenue attack would be. So, even though the backhand was Manstein's view, the Soviets adopted it, even though they may not have put the strategy in certain structural terms. The Soviets waited, built up forces and reserves, and deeply entrenched themselves. Once the German offensive was spent, they brought up their fresh reserves and counterattacked, plunging deep into German lines. The Wehrmacht did not expect this at all, and they were seriously mauled in the process. Once the front stabilized again, Hitler adamantly refused to allow Manstein to practice his Bewegungskrieg, even though it had brought such wonderful results most of the time, because he was suspicious that it was a secret way of retreating. Hitler wanted his troops to stand, fight, and die in the trenches like it was in the First World War, and he didn't understand all this moving about behind the enemy lines and such. Eventually, as with many other generals and field marshals, Hitler had had enough of Manstein. He was replaced. German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was, and still is, considered by many to be a great strategist in the Prussian tradition. He had his faults, and no one can defend his Nazi sympathies. Please put down in the comments below what you think of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and his backhand strategy.